Okay, so on page 10 we have some of our final configurations, and the first one is what we call noble gas configuration. And on the periodic table, the noble gases are at the end of each row. So they're here all the way from helium down to OG. These are the noble gases, and we're going to treat these kind of like landmarks, so we don't always have to start all the way back at 1s2. The way we're going to do that is by putting the noble gases symbol in some of these square brackets, and then we're going to use that as our starting point to finish out the configuration. So we don't have to start all the way back at the beginning, but there is always just one noble gas that we can or should start at in order to get to a specific element. And that's going to be based off of where the element is in the periodic table. For example, we're going to be starting with magnesium and gold as these first two examples. On our way to magnesium, we went across the first row, past helium, and across the second row, past neon, and then a little bit farther. So neon is going to be our starting point for magnesium. It's the last noble gas we pass through on the way to neon. It's the last noble gas we pass through on the way to magnesium. Now, instead of trying to trace this row by row by row, the easy way, no matter what, once you find the element you're trying to get to figure out what noble gas you need to use as your starting point, go to the row above it at the end. That's always going to be the last noble gas that you pass through on the way to your specific element. So for gold, we're going to be starting at xenon. So for our magnesium noble gas configuration, like we said, we're going to start at neon because that was the last noble gas we passed through on the way to magnesium. Neon's at the end of the second row. Where do we go once we're at the end of the second row? Well, the beginning of the third row. That's where our 3s orbitals are added. And how many spaces in do we have to go to get to magnesium? 2. That is the that's the noble gas configuration. That is the whole configuration we have to write for the noble gas configuration for magnesium. Now gold, if you remember on page 8, gold almost made you want to quit. Your hand was falling off by the time we were finished with it because it was all the way down in that 6th row. But when we start at xenon, that last noble gas that we pass through on the way to gold, that's at the end of the 5th row. So all we've got to do to get to gold, start the 6th row, go to that 6s, 2 spaces in. Don't forget that that bold line tells us we have to go through the 4 Fs before we can get to the 5 Ds. And there are 14 of those 4 Fs there. And then 5D, just 9 spaces in. And that's not that bad. That's all we got. That is gold's noble gas configuration. What that's telling us is we have the same electrons as xenon and then a few more. And honestly, these outermost electrons are the most important ones. So that repetitive 1s2, 2s2, 2p6 stuff isn't really the most useful way to spend our time if we're focused on those outermost elements, electrons. So there are 4 more examples, and I'm actually going to ask you to do these yourself. But what I want to make sure that we agree on is where we should start at for each of these. Where is the noble gas that we should start at? So I want you to look at your periodic table, find each of these elements. Sulfur is element number 16. It's over there in the P block. Find sulfur, go 1 row up and to the end, and hopefully you agree neon is the last noble gas that we pass through on the way to sulfur. So that should be our starting point. Fe is element 26. It's kind of there at the top middle of our D block. Find iron. There's a blank space above it, but just go 1 row up all the way over to the end, and you should be finding argon as the noble gas that we can start at. Borium would be cruel and unusual punishment to ask you to write out the full configuration for. It's all the way down there in the 7th row, kind of in the middle of the D block there. But with the noble gas configuration, if we find borium, element 107, go a row up to the end, radon is going to be our new starting point, and that's going to make this a lot easier. And then xenon. Xenon is a noble gas. It's element 54, all the way over there in our last column. And a lot of people are tempted, well, it's a noble gas, so couldn't its noble gas configuration just be Xe? But unfortunately, no, it's not that easy. With our analogy about directions, that'd be like me asking you, hey, how do I get to Xenon's house? And you reply, oh, you go to Xenon's house. That is not descriptive at all. That is not helping anyone. Now, we know this isn't really directions, but we still have to do the same thing we do with every other element. Find xenon, and then go to the row above it. The last noble gas we pass through on our way to xenon is krypton, Kr. So these are your starting points. You still need to finish the rest of these configurations, and each of them is going to have 2 or 3 terms that you have to go through in order to actually finish this out. But none of them are going to be longer than 3 terms to get across the rest of that next row. So please feel free to check these with me in class. Make sure that you're on track. And then there's some noble gas stuff. That's the part C on pages 11 and 12. So hopefully you have A and B done, and this is a nice short way to finish that off. You have a couple of noble gas configurations on page 13, both to find an element with and to identify if you're doing that right or wrong. This should let you finish out all of question number 10 here. So remember, 3 of these are incorrect. You should only have 1 of them that's correct and 2 of them that are incorrect. Sorry, 3 incorrect, 1 correct. And then there are some noble gas configurations for you to do on page 14. None of that should take very long because these are so nice and short and simple.